Hello and welcome to episode number 8 of the Curling Legends podcast. My name is Kevin Palmer, and each week during the curling season, I share a conversation with a player or storyteller from the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. We cover curling from the invention of the slide through to the adoption of the free guard zone. This is part 2 of my conversation with Warren Hansen. If you haven't listened to it yet, you should check out part 1 of my conversation with Warren on episode number 7. You can get from iTunes, Stitcher, any number of applications you may use on your smartphone to get your podcasts. You can also find us on our website at curlinglegends.ca and on Facebook at facebook.com/curlinglegends. In part 2, Warren and I discuss many topics, including the Olympics. We return to the 1974 Silver Broom. We talk about the challenges of putting a Brier in an NHL arena. We talk about the creation of the Continental Cup and the mixed doubles. Warren also shares his thoughts on the boycott era that happened in the early 2000s, as well as where he thinks curling needs to go in the future. Let's get right to part 2 of our conversation with Warren Hansen.
I knew where it had to go if, in fact, the sport was going to get any credibility. And then in 1982, Calgary gets awarded the Olympics. I still remember phoning Ray Kingsmith and said, hey, how do we get this thing demonstration? And again, it was him and I that through that first phone call, he went and did investigating with the Calgary committee and found out who we had to talk to. And then I think it was about the first week of December of 1983, we met Brian Murphy at the Westin Hotel in Calgary for breakfast.
And I hear there was 6 sports that were in consideration at the time.
So from that meeting, he said, I'll get back to you. And he came back to us within a month and said, okay, we've got 6 sports that are going to be considered, which was curling, short track, freestyle, ballroom dancing, and sled dogging. 5.
Sled dogging, ski orienteering
right.
was the other one. Yeah, but
6.
Sled dogging is, I found fascinating.
And he initially told us, he said, we're only going to accept 2.
And who makes this decision?
They do.
They being
the Calgary Organizing Committee.
The organizing committee. So it's not the IOC or somewhere else.
It's the Calgary Organizing Committee.
So that might have been good for curling.
Well, probably in the end it was, because he then told us the process. And in August of 1984 or 83, anyway, I'm not totally... we had to go into, we were given 15 minutes to make a presentation. With
how long?
15 minutes.
15.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's not a lot.
Along with the other 6 sports. We were all there the same day, one behind the other.
Yeah. Did the dogs actually come to that event, or they probably left them tied up outside?
So I went to CBC, and the guy who was executive producer at the time, Bob Moyer, and he put together a tape for us on their coverage. It was very well done, and we kind of used that as the introduction to the whole thing, and then did the whole pitch on why curling should be a demo in 1988. Said, fine, we'll be back to you before October. And we found out, again, roughly the 1st of October, that they decided, because of the strong presentations from short track, freestyle, and curling, that they accept 3 rather than 2.
Oh, because originally it was just going to be 2.
Yes.
Oh, all right.
And
so you don't really know if to this day, probably you don't know whether curling was 1, 2, or 3, but it doesn't matter.
I doubt it. I doubt that it was 1 or 2.
You think that maybe it was done so well, and because of just everything that lined up, that you guys were able to get.
And then we went through another from that point on. So I mean, it's always interesting with the CCA and the WCF, who always like to put their hands up of we did this, and they did nothing. They didn't become part of this until after it had been determined.
Who's that? You said the CCA, you mean?
CCA or the WCF.
Yeah.
This was all done by Kingsmith and I.
Yeah. Well, was it even the WCF at that? What was it called at that point?
ICF.
ICF, yeah.
So they became involved by the middle of by February probably 1985.
Yeah.
As far as a lot of the final things that had to be agreed upon, which was the length of games and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the meantime, we got in a big hassle about venue. They wanted to initially put it in the Calgary Curling Club. And again, Kingsmith and I knew to properly stage this thing, it had to go into an arena. So we finally got agreement in the end that they would split the Max Bell Arena between short track and curling. That they would run curling the first half and short track the second, which would work fine. It wouldn't work the other way around. And away we went. So then on this side of the pond, or of the picture, then became the next issue of how are we going to select teams and who's going to represent Canada.
You take my questions before I ask them, Warren, but that's okay. Although I do want to go back to uniform colors in the Brier. We could probably talk for hours about some of my frustration there, but that's okay. Like why Ontario had that weird brown sweaters for a long time. But anyway, let's go back to this Olympics. So was there, at that stage, So now it's determined there's going to be an event. And so this would be about 85. You said 85?
About 85.
About 85. So where are the players at in terms of their thinking at that point? Because they're focused on the Brier, they're focused on the Bonspiel circuit. What's happening?
I don't think they.
Was there any thoughts to the Olympics?
Well,
do you think,
I
in
don't
a lot of
think
minds
so.
of players?
I don't think any of those guys at that period of time thought to the point
next
of
season. Well, sometimes you didn't know the 4 guys you were going to have on a team next
I don't think
year,
they
right?
thought to the point of the fact that unless the sport becomes Olympic, it isn't going anywhere. They'd never crossed that
But I guess
line.
what I'm saying is that, there weren't guys at the time, maybe there were some, that in 1985 who said, we got to think about that Olympics in 3 years. Because most teams were thinking about that season and then thinking, am I still on this team next year? I mean, that's what I think a lot of squads would consider, right?
I don't think it was an active issue in the minds of any of these guys. Until we started to move with it, and so we had made
Sticks and Stones: The Battle for the Soul of Curling. Oh, when's that coming?
That's a story in its own right.
When's it coming?
That was done 2 years ago.
2 years ago. How come I haven't seen it?
Because it's never been aired.
Because it's never been aired. Okay. Why hasn't it been aired? So I'm looking at Sticks and Stones: The Battle for the Soul of Curling. It's a glossy. It's leading right into the questions, of course, that I have. How come it hasn't aired?
Well, that's an interesting question. So that documentary was done by a company that's based in Regina and Vancouver. And they have a base in Regina because of the money the Saskatchewan government provides towards film industry.
Okay.
So they originally signed the contract with the government and City TV, which is Rogers. Mm-hmm. And this was made in the summer of 2013. Most of the work was done. Mm-hmm. The final ends of it were complete at the Continental Cup in Las Vegas. This thing was completed in the summer of 2014. Mm-hmm. So I got notification that it was going to be aired on Rogers on September 27th, roughly, full network. And for the 3 days following, it was going to be aired 8 o'clock at night on City TV Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. 2 weeks before it was supposed to be aired, the guys contacted me and said, this whole thing's on hold.
Okay.
Sportsnet will not air it. To this day, the process that took place between that point in time, finally in the spring of 2015, they settled with Rogers so that they could, in fact, try and sell it to somebody else. But to this point in time, I put it in front of TSN. There was no deal struck there, so it's never been aired.
Has it been seen?
Oh, it's been seen. Oh,
okay.
Yeah. Oh, you bet.
Yeah. Just not by the broader
public. But it hasn't been aired. It's been seen by many people. Mm-hmm. So it's 45 minutes long.
Yeah.
It's the whole story.
And it's the definitive story of the 88 Olympics.
Virtually how we got the sport in the Olympics, and then the process that finally led to the sport becoming medal.
So the first steps in terms of going back to determining a team.
Well, okay. So
what was involved with that?
We established a committee. It was the National Team Program Committee, and so the people who ended up in that committee was myself. I was the chair. Gary DeBlond, Ron Anton, Vera Pezer, and Art Quinney as a physiologist, Vera Pezer as a psychologist, and 2 representatives, Harry Mazinki from the CCA and Dart McRae from the CLCA. So our task was to determine how the teams would be selected for the 1988 Olympics. So there was a whole bunch of things that we didn't know about this sport at that point in time as well. We had no idea what the physical condition was of the athletes, but certainly, again, appreciating going forward, if this thing was going to fly in the Olympic circle, it had to be athletic. Because if there was any ever thing slipped out that this thing wasn't as athletic as other Olympic sports, it had no chance.
So at that point, you're trying to determine a team or teams, because a men's and a women's team, but the aspect isn't just saying I need a team that's going to win the gold medal. You're actually looking at it from, this is a demonstration. The winning of the medal actually means less than, and much less than the actual impact of the sport.
This has to look right.
Yeah.
So along started the process. So we finally agreed that the trials for the Olympics would be 8 teams, and there'd be 2 ways you could go. You could win your way there, or you could go through another process where we were going to do some experimenting on how you got there. Mm-hmm. The other process was selection camps. So we set up 2 camps. One was here. The other one was in Toronto, and in the fall of 1987, where we invited X number of players because of their past performance in the sport to attend the camps. There were people who chose not to go. Al Hackner's team chose not to go. Ed Lukowicz's team chose not to go.
Just because, in their opinion, it's a team game and they wanted to be as a team.
Like the process.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, what were some of the other ideas that were thrown out in that committee, or like that you landed on this? Were there? I could imagine there must have been all sorts of different. Was there other?
We were experimenting.
Yeah.
And so we needed to find out, we were determining and working on ways of assessing people technically, ways of assessing people mentally, and ways of assessing people physically, which probably still today should be done to far more extent than it is. But because of all the shit that flew around this, it never went the next step. I mean, I'm in the U.S. right now. What I'm doing down there, they need to be moving in this direction because you've got to know what you're dealing with from a talent point of view and what kind of a commitment if you're going to move ahead to the podium.
I think the big struggle was, and at the time, I'm a young junior and I'm listening to all of what's going on and what I'm reading through the, what's written in the paper, because we read newspapers back then, if you remember, was this idea that you could take a team and split it up. And so it's fascinating, and it's even fascinating on the comment I made earlier about how teams each year a lot of times would change teams. Yet I think there was very much a belief that, you couldn't separate players for the Olympics. You had to go as a team because it's not just about the physical aspect, it's about all the other pieces that go along. But what's fascinating is that a lot of times these teams did split up from year to year.
And the other factor is this: every other sport in the world at this level is not put together by the team, it's put together by a coach. And that's still a reverse thing we have going on today. The teams are picking the coaches, the coaches don't pick the teams, so the coach has no impact on that team other than what they want him to have.
See, so I look at it both ways. I look at it a little bit nostalgically, and I think that's interesting and unique about the sport. It certainly is, right? Did you see that right from the early stages, comparing it against your football experiences, to think this is dramatically different?
Yes.
And there's a gap there.
Well, again, it's what is required for the rest of the world to accept this. Because if it's only the curling world, we aren't going anywhere. And this has to come across in a different way, or it's not going to fly. And I still believe that today. I mean, we would never. So this whole process starts.
Yeah.
And it goes fine, except when it comes down to determining the teams that are going to be selected. So it was relatively simple, except in one case. And that was the case involving Mr. Werenich. He had come into the whole thing. It was a bit of a joke to him. He didn't really try very hard with any aspect of it. Didn't put any effort into it. So at the end of the day, his team had all made it, was fine. He didn't.
Okay. And that team, and let's go back to that, that's the dream team, right, of the 83. Won in 83. If not for a Mike Riley win in 84, would have won, 2 Briers in a row.
So
competent squad.
The discussion started. And
so this would have been what year then? This was in
87.
In 87, yeah.
As to what are we going to do? And so I was one who said, okay, we had a number of teams that chose not to enter this process. They chose to go the other side and take their chances in even winning the Brier, or coming second in 87, 86, and 87. And there were others. There was Burtnick, Folk, Lukowicz, Hackner. They didn't enter. They didn't go. They did not go to the camps.
Yeah.
Werenich did. So my point was, when he agreed to come here, he knew what this was.
So he could have agreed not to go to the camp, like Al Hackner and some of the other people you mentioned. Okay.
He knew what was going.
Do you think he went intentionally?
Oh, with Eddie, who
knows? Right? He may have just gone to.
So my point was, okay, if we all sit here and agree that this was an experiment in trying some new and different ways of beginning to, at some point in time, move the sport forward. Because remember, again, this is a demonstration sport right now. It's not an Olympic medal sport. Yeah. We have to stand by what we agreed to. He didn't make it.
Now, how did that get determined?
Well, there's this committee of 7 people, right, that I mentioned to you.
Yeah.
So the discussion goes around and around. And
so you have to know before that gets announced that this is going to have a ripple, though. Right?
Well, if it had gone the way I wanted it to, the ripple would have lasted one day. It would have been over in one day. But what happens is we had people on a committee who were emphatic that we can't put this team out there without Ed Werenich. They won't even play. That's their decision. We're sticking by what we have agreed to as to how we're going to select these teams. So it goes around and around and around. And then somebody, and I won't name who, brought up the issue of, well, the physical component. And I think I was the first one to say that physical component out of a mark of 100 is 5% And we all agreed when starting this was fact-finding, which is why it was only 5%. We're trying to find out what kind of physical condition these people are in overall. It's finding something about something we know nothing about right now, to have no bearing on who goes and who doesn't. So in the final vote, where I was on the side, the 2 that voted against, 5 voted for, I'll always remember saying, I hope you realize what you've just done.
You mean voted for? So you voted against keeping Ed out of the...
No, I voted against him being in it.
Against him being in, okay.
Because the solution that had been come up with, besides Ed, 2 other people didn't meet the physical component. It was Randy Ferbey and Paul Savage. So if we make all 3 of them meet the physical component, then all the people involved will have met the physical component, and I again say, no, that was not the way this was designed. Those other 2 guys made it on the merit that we had originally determined that existed. It is not fair to them to bring them into this, whatever you want to call it, with Ed Werenich.
Yeah.
Again, I was voted out, 5-2. And the agreement is that Ed Werenich will be acceptable to play with this team, as will Paul Savage and will Randy Ferbey, if all 3 of them meet the physical component by this date.
Okay.
Well, predictable as sure as the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
All hell breaks loose. And of course, I get to be the guy that stands in the center and wears the brunt of it because I'm also the director of media relations.
Well, so let me ask you this. So before that time, Warren, had you, again, I'm coming at this from like a young junior growing up in Manitoba. You know, the perception came through that somehow you were the guy, you know, that point person in the CCA. And as you said, like your association with the CCA has probably been a little bit tenuous, certainly recently as well, right? So it's not a case that you really represented the CCA, but somehow you became...
I became the voice of it.
That voice of it. Was there a time before that then where that had sort of started, or was this really where it really came to a
Well, because for 10 years, I was the guy that was trying to change something that nobody wanted to change.
Yeah.
I was the change agent. Out of every time I dealt with 10 people, 6 of them were against me because they didn't want anything changed.
But it's not like you didn't have your supporters, then, clearly, and I don't think we'd be this point.
I had many people who saw things exactly.
Ray
was one. I had some good guys back in the CCA in the day that C-SWAT, Tom Fisher.
There must have been some in the player community.
Some of them, there were guys that were, but it was usually the quieter guys that understood. I mean, a guy like Eddie Lukowicz, he understood. Neil Houston understood. Pat Ryan, after I spent a day with him in 1987, understood. Rick Folk understood. So a lot of them got it. They weren't really warm and fuzzy about it, but at least they understood what was attempted to be done.
I think you can appreciate that. So you take a sport that is largely felt to be owned by the players, right? In that you choose your own teams, you go out and it's every guy who's a farmer or a lawyer or works in a bar, it doesn't matter, right? It's sort of that grassroots model, and so
as in Bob Wheat says in this, what does he say? Take 2 guys, a plumber and a pipe fitter, and
away you go. And so there's this, and I think that's and I mean it is a very glorious aspect of the history of the sport. So all of a sudden, there's this sense of another party, someone else, determining or changing without any input. And so I guess my question is, was there input from that community of players? It sounds like at times you had support, but there wasn't almost even a mechanism to have that type of model, was there? And again, there wasn't a lot of time. I mean, that's the other point to this too. And I guess maybe to match those goals, it would be hard to do.
By the time you spent trying to convince enough people that what you're trying to do is correct, and you can go back to athletes are athletes. And I'll just go back to discussions you've been having here the last 2 years with some of these guys involved now and saying, hey, you guys need to do this, 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 and this. And the guys I talk to get it. They say, yeah, but these other guys, all they care about is themselves and what's happening today. And I'm saying, well, if they don't start looking about what's going to happen here tomorrow, they're going to get eaten up by this thing. Like, they got to wake up. And they go, yeah, we know, but we don't know how to. And so it's always been that way. I mean, to try and get those people to... Athletes are very internal people. I was there. I know the whole picture. So to try and get them to buy in or to see something when you're trying to make something that changes that was as dramatic as we had to do here, it was impossible. And so in the end of this documentary, I mean, that's one of the questions they say to me. So would you do it all differently if you were to do it again? And I said, I suppose possibly down the path of more consultation, maybe. I don't know.
But the end result might be this. And I think part of it is, and I think it's important to note, right, that Warren, there was a recognition that this isn't an Olympic sport. This is just a demonstration that we in Alberta have been allowed to demonstrate. This is not the IOC. This is not someone else.
No.
We don't have the global support yet to make this happen. Not to say that, because as it was, I think it actually, the following Olympics, there wasn't a curling.
Well,
correct?
no,
Or there was still demonstration again,
this
right?
is what happened.
Yeah.
So we managed to, I suppose, piss off the IOC in 1988 more than anything else.
You think so? Yeah.
Through two things. One was this whole kerfuffle with the physical, which they had to be well aware of. And the second one was Kingsmith and I were pretty much working of the opinion that we had been told that the whole decision of whether this sport's going to become medal is going to be based on how you present it in Calgary. That's going to be.
Do you think it was the aspect that it blew up, or the aspect that it exposed a disregard for a lot of the top players?
No,
for the physical aspect, or what was it?
Because the huge attention that was drawn to the lack of physical fitness in this sport and the whole kerfuffle.
It actually highlighted it to some extent.
Yes, that it caused in this country. It just brought the whole focus on it.
Yeah.
That combined with the fact that we did a very good job of presenting curling in '88, too good. Because what it did, it got a lot of focus that medal sports didn't get. And Walter Troger, who was the director of sport at that point in time for the IOC, before the Olympics was over, made the statement that this will never happen again. Because after 1992, there will be no more demonstration sports. And they stood by that. That was the end of 92.
Being because more because they didn't want to take attention away?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because demonstration sports were there in their minds to be in the background and to kind of show us what these sports are, not to come in as we did and take the same focus in the Olympics as the medal sports.
So they
did.
probably didn't recognize that. Oh, we happen to be in Calgary, which is one of the Alberta is a huge center of curling.
They knew nothing about curling.
Yeah, they didn't understand that, and
so those two things combined.
Yeah, you almost did too well in some aspects.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing was they stuck by that. They did not back down on that. That was the end of tennis sports.
So after '92, at that point, there was still a challenge to get curling approved, or at what stage did? Yeah.
Oh God, yes.
There was a lot of work done, right? Yeah. And was that that was a primary goal at that point for a lot of people? I'm assuming to keep moving that forward. And, were there people that said, "Well, we don't need the Olympics"?
Well, it was following '88. The whole kerfuffle. The Olympics ended in end of February, and Ray died, I think, on the 1st of May, and we knew it was destined. So they came out, and I guess in September, and announced that out of Calgary that curling would not be a medal sport going forward because it didn't have enough countries. That had never been a point of emphasis by anybody before then, that if without the 25 countries law, it was in their constitution, but they had already put women's hockey in with nothing, right? And so they'd done it before, but it gave them a good reason not to do it, along with this other kerfuffle that just said, we're not going to do this right now. So at that point in time, I stepped back, and Ray was gone, and the WCF took it over. And kind of three guys, Gunter Hummelt, who eventually became the president of WCF, Franz Tanner, who had played lead for his son when they won the world in 1981, who had IOC connections out of Switzerland, and Jack Lynch, who was a Canadian. And what Jack Lynch's tie was, he was a curler, but Jack Lynch was also the retiring technical director of the Canadian Olympic Committee. So he had connections all over the world inside the IOC movement. So those three guys combined set out the task of getting the 25 countries in fall of 1988. By 1991, I believe, they had accomplished that. They had 25 countries who were registered members of the World Curling Federation. So it went back to the Program Commission for the second time for consideration, and for the second time, they said no. So it was refocused, and it went back again in April of 1992 for the third time. And this is the one where it gets interesting, because by this time I had been in Japan since the mid-'80s. I had very good connections with what was going on in Japan. And Japan had, at that point in time, been awarded the 1998 Olympics, and they wanted curling to be its first presentation in 1998. And curling had also gained a fair amount of momentum within the whole Japanese sports scene.
Okay.
And there were some other interesting things going on there. When I first started going over there, and dealing with Japanese is very different, it's very secretive. And it was through the embassy I was so I fortunately had that input. But everywhere I went, I was staying in these Prince hotels, and every Prince hotel seemed to have a hockey arena attached to it, and they put curling ice, and I'm like, man, who's paying for all this, right? And they don't tell you. And then I find out there's a connection, the Prince hotels and curling. So the other thing I couldn't figure out, this old guy who was at that point mid-70s at least, named Nandu, he was appointed as president of the Tokyo Curling Association, but he didn't know anything about curling. Rock from bowling ball. I'm like, what is this? So then, through some of the embassy people, and I finally find out the connection that Nando had taught this guy in university by the name of Tasumi.
Okay.
And it went further that Nando's son was Tasumi's executive assistant. And who Tasumi is that's the Japanese railroad system, the Tasumi family.
Okay.
At that point in time, Tasumi was the richest man in the world, like worth 19 billion, something like that nature. But he was also a sport enthusiast. And he owned the Tokyo Lions baseball team. He owned 15 golf courses. He was a big player in the Japanese Olympic Committee, etc., etc., etc. Nando had brought him into the fold. He owns the Prince Hotels.
Okay.
So he was funding all this through Tasumi.
But why hockey and curling? What was it that just...
The guys, Hiroshi Kobayashi, these are the guys that were originally with the whole curling side of things, somehow knew Nando, knew his connection, and brought him into the circle.
Okay.
Don't know. Anyway, so this existed. I knew it existed. So in April of 1992, the program commission...
Which at this point now, it's after the second demonstration.
This is the third.
Which was in 92 was...
But that mattered nothing.
So that really didn't have much...
Nothing.
Positive or negative...
Zero.
In 92. Why did they even demonstrate it in 92 then?
Because they'd already agreed to.
Oh, I see. So it was okay.
It was the end of demonstration sports.
Got you.
So in April of 92, program commission meets to talk about curling for the third time. And they vote it down again for the third time. I get a phone call from Hiroshi, Japan. He says, who, Mr. Ken Reid? It's a Canadian skier. Why? Why would he speak against curling? And so I start to make some inquiries here in Canada, and I find out that Ken Reid is sitting in the program commission as an athlete representative. And he had, in this discussion on curling becoming a demonstration sport, been the major guy talking against it.
So the rest of the world must think, why is a Canadian talking...
Japan had two people sitting in the program commission. They go back to Japan, who have been instructed to vote in favor of it and have been told Canada will support it. And they go back, you told us Canada would support this, and this Canadian, Ken Reid, comes in and poo-paws it.
So there's no one else there in that committee from Canada
he
represents this individual. Okay.
No. I mean, the program commission is probably about 10, 11 people appointed from within, can be from any country.
Did you know Ken Reid at all? Okay, so you'd never met this man, or have you met him since?
No, I've never talked to Ken Reid. And so I'm blindsided by these guys. Then we start figuring out that, and he admitted publicly that he'd spoken against, because it didn't belong,
Sorry, was it a personal opinion or the opinion of Sport Canada? Like, this is what I don't understand.
It was his personal opinion. It was his opinion.
Yeah.
But he's a skier. Think about it. Do you want to cut the pie one more time?
Yeah, exactly.
Which curling becomes, because it wasn't like short track or freestyle. It wasn't within the existing discipline. Yeah. Curling gets in, the pie gets cut one more time. So it's going to cost them money. So they don't want it. So it's been voted down for the third time. So at this point in time, these guys in Europe, Hummelt and Franz Tanner, they're running around with all these IOC people, but I mean, God bless Gunter and Franz, they don't have the power within that circle to probably sway many minds. And so I'm talking back and forth with Hiroshi after all this happens, and he keeps telling me, oh, don't worry, I think it will be okay. And I mean, what do you think it's going to be okay? These guys are going to go into that IOC executive meeting in Barcelona, and they're going to tell them for the third time, curling is not going to be recommended.
Yeah.
Don't worry, not to worry. So sure enough, I mean, they go in and they do for the third time say, we don't recommend it.
And you had spoken to them about that conversation ahead of them going into that meeting?
Spoken to?
Well, so after that conversation that you had,
everybody knew.
Everyone knew at this point.
Everybody knew that they weren't going to recommend it. So they do. They go in and say for the third time no, and Samaranch stands up and says, go back and reconsider. And to this day, nobody knows why, but I have my own feelings that it was Tasumi, because I can't think of anybody else who had had the power and clout to be able to call a marker on Samaranch to change his opinion. That's what happened.
Not for anything that clearly Ken Reid and Canadian sport had in terms of involvement in it. It's fun. Like, I'm not even sure what that involvement is.
The one guy that continued to speak in favor of it was Dick Pound.
Yeah.
Dick Pound may have also had some influence. To what degree? I'm sure maybe it was Dick Pound and Atasumi. Maybe between the two of them convinced Samaranch that he needed to look at it further.
So let's go into that stage then in terms of the curling community and the top teams. And, where do you think the sense was then even at that point? Did we really want it? I mean, we'd had a taste of it a little bit. We'd had representation. I
don't think it probably really began to sink in with the curling populace of Canada probably till about 1996 as to what it meant to be an Olympic medal sport.
I mean, I have to think that a lot of the players... I mean, the dream was always the Brier or the Scotties. That was kind of always as when you're growing up, right? And even the Worlds, I think, for a lot of years was an add-on, right?
Wernich's comments in this documentary, he says, well, it's probably a good thing I never went to the Olympics. I was getting pretty opinionated by them, ha, ha, ha. And, I always thought it was kind of a good thing. It's just another thing to play in.
Yeah.
Right? That was sort of his approach to it, not another thing to play in, really is. So you don't see that Olympic gold medal is worth any more than a Brier in a world championship, that it was just another thing, right?
Even the world championship or the Scotch Cup as it originally started wasn't the Brier, right? It had to start to build some real meaning for a little while. And I'm sure a lot of, maybe as we, maybe back in the 70s when Canada wasn't winning in the men's, it wasn't a huge loss. I mean, I'm sure guys were disappointed, but I did talk with Eddie about it, and he was very disappointed, clearly.
Well, having gone down that path, you don't ever forget.
I want to go back to this because, you mentioned to me twice in this conversation, and just passing, that in 74 you were in a bad place, or that experience in 74 was a bad experience. I don't know, maybe we've touched on certain parts of it. What was it that was such a bad experience in 74?
Well, first of all, I don't know what the stones were that we used or where they came from, but I've never seen anything like it before or since. Some people believe they were an alpine rock with a 4-inch cup. I don't know what the hell they were, but I've never seen anything that moved on a sheet of curling ice that fast in my life. A draw was 29 seconds. Or I should say move that slow. You could sweep a rock 6 feet and take it 8. So it was just, everything was just, and it's how bizarre it was. I remember we played Sweden in the one semifinal game, and Somerville played Peter Adinger in the other one. And they went 2 extra ends. Adinger had the hammer. And in both times, he chose to hit a rock in the 12-foot circle and rolled out versus throwing a draw. And even to hit a rock, you could hit 9/10 of it and roll out. To put a draw in the rings was a major challenge at times. I mean, during that week, we had gone through on our team where we would play an entire game and one player couldn't put a rock in the circles.
Oh, yeah.
And we all lost it at different times. And so it was, the interesting thing was from that time on 1974 till Air Canada left in 1985, they took the rocks every year. They were the MCA rocks from Canada that were used for every world championship from there on.
So going to that World Championships, did the whole team still have a sense of like this is an incredibly important event, we're representing Canada?
Oh, yeah.
Or was there wasn't just a satisfaction of our goal was the
But
Brier.
it's to complete your own circle. I mean, you got to win that. You had to win that World Championship to complete the circle. I mean, there's a whole pile of. I mean, we go in there and it was kind of a revolutionary turn for the sport in Switzerland. I mean, this young team, Adinger, that were all in their early 20s, and the crowds they were unbelievable, and there were people that knew nothing about curling. And so I will remember forever, these cowbells were just, and I mean, every time we missed a shot, there was 12,000 people ringing cowbell. I didn't know. And when we played them in the round robin, that was the largest crowd to ever watch a curling game until here in, I think, when would we have that first big crowd here? 1997.
97 in Calgary, yeah.
That's how long that record stood.
Wow, yeah.
And I mean, you compared today, I was in the World Championship in Basel last year, and you could count the people in the building, right? But they were crowds, 12,000, 14,000 to pretty near every one of those games.
So obviously they did something right in terms of bringing people to the event, even if they didn't understand the game.
And then on the other thing that happened, I mean, back in those days, there was no rules about smoking. I mean, Hector was a chain smoker. And so the day before the thing starts, they say, well, by the way, we don't want anybody to smoke on the ice because in Switzerland, they're just starting to get money for curling and it's a sport. And well, Hector says, screw you. And he goes out there and chain smokes. Well, pardon me, all hell broke loose. I mean, it was just, we were crucified. Swiss media just hung us out to dry.
Yeah.
Through all the things that went on there with these huge crowds and We never even saw anybody from the Canadian Curling Association or nothing. We were completely, totally on our own. And I mean, it was such a difference from prior to that, every other World Championship that had been held in Europe, maybe there's 1,000 people there.
It sounds like that event and those moments really shaped a lot of your drive and direction in future years of how to shift what's going on in the sport. And probably had to see, okay, you saw that there was a sense
there was little we
of
could
growth,
control. There was little we could control. It was out of
Yeah.
our control.
Yeah.
There was nothing we could do. And it was unbelievable frustrating. I mean, what do you say? I mean, coming out of there under proper conditions on the teams we were playing that we would have won that thing 99 times out of 100. But we didn't. You sort of go like, so what is this all about? I've pounded my head here for 10 years to get here, and this is what this is. This is what it is.
So the only thought I'd have to that, and you made an interesting comment. So at that point, you're an athlete. You're competing. You felt like you had no control. I think to some extent, the flip side can then be some of the comments we talked about earlier, where some of top curling and top athletes feel like they aren't in control. So you've had that feeling. So you kind of, I would imagine you can sort of empathize at times.
Well, when I say no control, we had no control over the playing conditions, the stones, how the whole thing was shaped. And it was something that was completely foreign to anything we'd ever seen before in our lives, and it was there. We couldn't deal with it.
So the 97 Brier, because you just touched on that. I did talk to Neil Houston a little bit about it. I'm fascinated a little bit because he talked that that was a big shift change. There was a big risk that was taken there because prior to that, and maybe you can explain it, something to do that had to take sort of financial liability around that Brier. So when was the thinking started that we could fill, an NHL hockey arena?
Oh, I probably started to believe that back in about 1993. I started to believe that if we do the following things right, and you see the problem was that that was back in the days when the host committees controlled the events. Even though they controlled the events, as long as Labatt's were there, they didn't have to pay for much. The Labatt's paid all the bills, and the host committee could sell a few tickets and a little bit of local sponsorship and pocket the money. But when Labatt's left, that changed overnight. And through a process that I probably didn't fully agree with, the entire fairly expensive operating those events was dumped down on the host committees in 1995. All the player expenses, everything. So, and I'm really the only guy. The one guy that has to try and direct these committees to get through this whole thing. So we're going to Halifax, and I still to this day don't know how the hell we got out of there with our hide, but we did. Following year in Kamloops, was still a different situation, 6,000-seat building. I mean, in those days, it was sold out a year ahead of time. So financially, there was no big risk. But now we go into Calgary, and I mean, I drove the bus to get that thing put in there, but then once it was in there and then started dealing with this whole thing from the hostman, started to see the challenges that we had ahead of us to try and run this thing in this big building and the money we had to raise, and it was a nightmare. And we somehow got through it with our hide, but it was at the point that I realized that the way these things are going to be run under this new way of doing business has to change because host committees, it's beyond their capability.
Well, it's one event that they might run every decade, right? Or maybe they've got a couple if they have different, The following
year, which then becomes the turning point, the thing is going to Winnipeg. And I'm going in there in April of 1997 for a meeting, and I get a call 2-3 days before getting there from Wayne Walker, who was the vice president of marketing on the committee, but also was a major player in First Investors Syndicate. And I knew him because he'd chaired the mix there in 1981. And I go and have a meeting with him, and he says, look, I have a very important job with this company. I neither have the time or wherewithal to worry about selling $1 million worth of sponsorship and $2 million worth of tickets. So I want you to meet a couple of people. And it was Rod Paulson and Chris Stevens. And basically the way he had set things up, that Rod was going to deal with the ticket marketing and things, and Chris with the whole sponsorship side of the business locally. And so a long story short, that was the beginning of the creation of the event management model that is still in place today. And those two guys continued on with it for quite some time beyond Winnipeg. And so we slowly but surely molded the thing into place that it was primarily run by professional people because it had to be. And I hear these things said, well, maybe the Brier should be once again run by host committees. And the fact is, it was never run by host committees. In the days of McDonald Tobacco, it was run by McDonald Tobacco, and by the days of Labatt's, it was run by Labatt's. And we went through that transition between 1995 and probably about 2000, where we went from host committees trying to run it to half the host committee, half us running it, to about 2000 when the CCA pretty much took complete control of the operation, is sort of how it evolved.
And I have to imagine sponsors are going to look much more favorably on an event where they can just come and show up and be the the vice president of so-and-so at the end versus running an entire... They don't want the
but the whole thing with regard to sponsorship changed immensely in the early 90s. I mean, virtually from a Labatt point of view, the 1980 Olympics changed the whole approach how people looked at sponsorship in Canada. From the mid-90s forward, sponsors have no interest in being involved with the operation of events. They want to receive the following benefits from the event, and they want you to tell them how much product or service that I provide is this event going to sell for me. And that's what it's all about. If there's no perceived value in a way economic return to a sponsor with an event today, they're not interested in it. And that's a challenge I've got with what I'm doing right now in the United States, because we haven't got any history. And we need to get sponsorship money into it, but it's almost we've got to get the television side of it moving, which will at least provide us with television numbers that are saleable, and then build the rest of it as we go along. Because today, a sponsor with a Canadian event, I mean, the television side of it is the main focus that they're after, but some of them also want to be able to execute at the event site level, which means you also got to have people in the building to complete the circle with them. But the number one thing is television. And the whole Season of Champions concept that we created in 1992, that whole thing is based on the value of a 30-second commercial. And it was set up the way it is. It's a first quarter media buy for those sponsors that are involved with it. That's the main focus of it. So different world from what it was in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. And how it evolved to the point where host committees can't run the event. And as I said, they never did, except for that brief period of time where we went through the transition in the mid-90s and got through it with our life somehow, because they haven't got the expertise to do it.
When you mentioned got through, was there a moment around the 97 Brier where you were nervous?
Yes.
Okay. Because you don't appear generally, Warren, to be a guy that gets nervous very easily.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I won't get into some of the things because incriminating some of the people who were involved, but there was some pretty frightful things took place there.
Yeah.
We were lucky to get out of there with our hide. We really were.
And it was also seen then as a dramatic shift.
Yes.
And that, maybe has waned a bit in recent years, and then maybe at the flip side of the growth in the Olympic piece. But I think...
the whole thing has to be refocused. And I mean, where we're heading, I mean, the biggest cloud around everything right now is the future of television and what's going to happen with that. And I'm still at a loss to what exactly is going on in the television world, particularly live sports production. The fact that they're still hanging the entire focus on the 30-second commercial, where it needs to be focused more around the utilization of advertising within the telecast through the better use of signage, screen-and-screen, pop-up ads, all those type of things, because the 30-second commercial is not going to do it much longer. I'm quite surprised.
Well, I mean, the truth is I might be in the minority, and certainly sports are an advantage because it's an event that takes place live. So, but today I record a lot of the curling.
Sure,
most of
everybody
it, and I skip through commercials. So but most people, it's still a valuable entity in that it's a live production. So most people are going to watch it as it happens.
But they'll click out of the commercials
if they can.
If they can. I mean, most people can. And I mean, the other problem you've got is the number of people that are subscribing to cable is dropping every day. And anybody under 40, highly unlikely that they even have cable anymore. So that whole world has to evolve. It has to change. And I maybe to some degree they're not sure what it has to change to. But from where I see it, it's going to go to the internet. And once it goes to the internet, the whole ability to measure the audience still hasn't been refined enough for them to have the same thing as they have with the BBMs, the Nielsen ratings that they have today with the information that they get out of it, right?
Well, and this isn't just a curling.
It's everything.
This is something that's related to to that. But you jumped ahead a little, Warren. So I want to go back. So following the 97 Brier, there's a couple of interesting things that start to take place. So there's an evolution of the Continental Cup. So let's touch on that first. When did the idea of creating that type of event begin?
Well, what happened was around 2000, St. Clair Group probably came to us and said the seniors in mixed, the television numbers are terrible. They're awful.
So prior to that, this wasn't a consideration, this type of an event of a
Well, it was still stumbling along.
Okay.
It was okay, but I mean...
I got to think at some point someone watched the Ryder Cup even in the 80s and said, wouldn't it be neat if we did this? Well, then maybe that...
No.
No?
I'll tell you exactly. So
the
St. Clair Group came back to us and said, we got to have something to replace those two events. So at the same time, the World Curling Federation had been nudged a bit by the IOC in the fact that they were the only winter sport that did not have a World Cup or anything other than World Championships. So there was some suggestion made to them that they needed another international event of some magnitude besides a World Championship.
And this all coincides at the same time.
Yeah, so we kind of agreed with them that, okay, let us work on something and see what we can come up with regard to an alternative. I guess I was probably the one originally that said, why don't we try and develop a Ryder Cup concept for curling? This is probably what would make the most sense because we're not going to develop a World Cup with one event. So let's go down that route. So
well, and what are you going to do? Have another World Championship? Like
yes.
It doesn't.
So it was easy, the team and the skins aspect of it, and determined that we needed probably two more variations of the discipline. So the one was relatively easy because we already had developed the singles concept with the hot shots. And the second one was I took upon myself to try and come up with something that would provide probably a number of things going forward that I felt was going to be necessary for the sport. Something that involved a smaller number of people, something that had a lot of scoring in it, and something that was going to be quick. And something that I felt would be something that would potentially give curling clubs in Canada an alternative to the current way we're playing the game that was going to be shorter and require fewer people. And so that was the whole concept around the mixed doubles, which I find quite interesting today, the fact that every place in the world has grabbed a hold of this except Canada, who of course now are trying to, but that it's proven to be extremely useful in many of these countries in the world where they don't have four players, but they got two.
When I even think, right, the traditional growth of the game was through your parents, right? And of course you can't sustain a growth of a sport that way, and if anything it starts to shrink, which it has. And if I look at someone who doesn't understand curling and they want to get involved, it's if you have to go walk into a curling club, right? It's a foreign place. It almost seems like a little private area where you're not sure, you're not comfortable. But if you're a couple and you just say, oh, you know what, we're just the two of us are going to go and do something on a Friday. Now all of a sudden it becomes a little more. I agree. I think it's a great opportunity for that.
And I still am a believer that
I don't like to watch it necessarily. I'll be honest. Maybe I'll warm up to it.
Well,
I'm getting there.
It's interesting. I mean, I took last year to watch a lot of it, the World Championship. I think if you spend some time watching it, you may change your mind on that, because the fact that they now do not have anybody holding the broom that you can sweep both of you if
which
you
I think
want.
kind of makes sense. Yeah,
I think it's fairly entertaining. And it's so wide open offensively that nobody is ever safe from a score point of view unless they're 5 up playing the last end. So I think all that serves a purpose too. I believe that doubles, not necessarily mixed doubles, can have a fairly prominent future with the sport moving forward. I still believe that a singles concept has got merit as well, and it's got merit from many angles, but certainly within a club, where again you can set up singles, you could even set up doubles to be completely non-committal. Put it up as a challenge round type of thing, where you challenge the people above you. The whole thing has to become less structured, less regimented. In a good example, I mean, golf's going through the same kind of issues. So I was aware of Topgolf for a while. There's one opened in Vegas in April, and I was just leaving the day it opened, so I didn't get a chance to look at it. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Went in this place at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. Talking 4 levels. It's a full entertainment package. So you rent a stall with up to 8 people, I believe. The balls got microchips in them. I mean, the far end of this driving range is like there's a big screen on there with an NFL game on. There's screens all over the place with different sports events. It's full bar, food. It's entertainment, and it doesn't require a commitment. The place is crawling with people at 8, and they're young, 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. And so the same kind of approach of that type of offering has to come to curling. It's something that's quicker, simpler, and fun.
Yeah.
Entertainment. They've got to be entertained. It's the same thing with people going to events today. You've got to entertain people from the minute they walk through the door, and whatever's happening on the field or the ice alone is not enough to do that on its own anymore.
I agree with you. I did the Topgolf. As I said, I maybe it's just a matter of bandwidth, because there's a lot of curling, there's a lot of stuff, and I have other things to do as well. So trying to consume as much of it, right, I think is hard. On the Continental Cup specifically, I've warmed up to it. It's something out of the gate that I was not all that fond of. In particular, I think some of the early scoring things got a little bit confusing, and I always felt that
we changed it a few times.
That's really improved it because if I can't understand it, I don't know how my mother, who used to have the VCR flashing 12, I don't know how she'd ever understand it. The only thing I'd caution a little bit, I guess, as it relates to the Hot Shots model and some of that singles, I had an experience in St. Albert where here in St. Albert when they hosted the Continental Cup, and I sat next to a fellow probably in his 50s, maybe 40s, 50s, and he was sitting beside his what seemed to be his mother, who was 70s, maybe 80s. And she seemed very confused, and she couldn't understand why they weren't curling. But I think maybe some of that is a little bit of an understanding of what the event is, and so that was her one draw that she probably came out of the house to come see, and she was a bit confused by it. Then again, I think chances are she's not still around, so probably we don't need to worry so much about that generation as we maybe do the next.
I use as an example, I use beach volleyball and rugby sevens as to variations of those sports that have made them take off, and that's why it has. Because it's got that different element that the original sport doesn't have in it to make it easy to embrace and entertaining.
So I want to let you go because it's been long and I know these can be trying, right? But I have to ask you about the boycott era.
Yeah.
Because again, that was an era where a lot was said. The media covers things a certain way. Players have certain opinions. It was an interesting period because we talked a lot about sponsors and how and how that's evolved. Maybe kind of just share, I guess, how you saw that evolve and just take us through that kind of brief period of time. And I like to think of it as brief, although it was really about 3 or 4 years or maybe 5 years.
Well, actually, no, it's probably longer than that because I was pushing on the CCA probably from 1995 forward.
Well, I was going to say even earlier, you talked about being part of that, trying to build a tour almost, right, as a player, even way back in the 70s.
Yeah.
So you had,
I was pushing for 95 forward, probably as soon as we started doing those big Briers, that they had to open up more. There had to be more for the players. Oh, we'd gone through a lot of discussions, and I guess there was big issues. They wanted to be able to have more cresting, and cresting is a Pandora's box because when you're an activity that curling is still trying to gain its legs with the whole sponsorship and fan world, values are really important. So anything within that ice area has to have a minimum value under. You start to devaluate it all. So there was a lot of struggles with that, and there still is. I mean, I still, you've got to deal with that whole thing really cautiously because if you can buy a crest on a player's uniform who is more visible out there probably than anything else for $5,000, how do you ever sell a hack sign or a back bumper for $100,000? Right? So that whole discussion. So I wanted the CCA to loosen up and make more money available to the athletes. You got to appreciate the fact that there's a lot of people that are there in control positions who are far removed from athletes and look at them as sort of we look at all the stuff they get already, or we already do too much for them. And so this was going back and forth. And there was a lot of discussions. And in some of those discussions, to some degree, the creation of the Continental Cup and the Canada Cup was aimed around the point of creating something where we could give them money that we couldn't readily do with a Brier because of all the restrictions and everything. Our hands were to some degree where things were currently sitting tied. However,
tied how? Just because
of sponsorship deals that were in place, and because of the way the whole thing was structured. Right? There wasn't much wiggle room. It was going to take 5 years to turn that around, or to begin to turn it around. I mean, there's still stuff going on today that I just kind of go, okay, I'm not there. So again, one more time, I get in the middle of what's going on, but trust me, I was a driving force for a lot of years to try and get more money in the hands of the players. And when the string was pulled in 2001, that was in the process of happening. It was already in place. The Continental Cup and Canada Cup, we announced them in September, but they had already been agreed upon. The whole asset with the Athletes Assistance Fund and the money that was going to start, that whole thing was already moving in that direction, but it wasn't there yet. And I think Kevin Albright saw an opportunity. He jumped into it. The whole idea of boycotting, what resulted from all that was going to happen anyway. It was in the process of happening. So was anything accomplished by it? I don't think so.
You can understand why it took place, though, right? Having been a player in the 70s and probably having seen, I think there was a sense from a lot of through the 80s that these teams wanted a say. I think for guys that had gone through it.
Well, they saw a lot of money there, but there wasn't really a lot of money there. You had host committees, you see, and you go through the 80s. The CCA wasn't getting much out of those events. It was the host committees, right?
I guess part of it is there was a struggle for them even on their own spot. But you think about it, so you're struggling to get sponsors, right?
Yep.
And then so the one thing that you can maybe, if you're a top player, you can say, a team, you can say to that sponsor, but look, here's an opportunity to be in the Brier and be, get this exposure. Maybe they were just, I guess, ultimately looking for other ways to help provide financial support into what, really ultimately was an amateur sport that cost more than it gained financially to a large extent, I think.
But during that time, it was actually Ann Merkliger and Jim Armstrong that were the player reps, and then Kevin Martin. I'm trying to remember who was in the what's her name? Who moved to Winnipeg, or for Regina from Winnipeg. Right up until when they pulled that pin there, we'd been we'd held a pretty serious meeting with them in, I think it was January or February, where we had more or less agreed as to things that were going to start to happen and it was going to be moved forward. And so I guess people such as they knew the Continental Cup and the Canada Cup were going to start, and they knew the money that was going to be attached to them that wasn't around before. So those events didn't come about as a result of that. They were already in.
So you don't think that the boycott itself changed what was inevitably already in motion, or the momentum that was taking place?
It was already going to happen. Yeah. It was already in motion. It would have been a long struggle.
It gave us some good stories, like Randy Duthame, and there was some really good stories of some players that ended up in the Brier that we probably may not have seen.
I sit here today. This is some of the things I was pushing. The players right now, they don't have the voice they should right now, but they need to get themselves pulled together. When you sit down right now at the table at either World Curling Federation or CCA events, the players need to have an equal spot at that table. But they've got to get themselves organized to the point of being able to do that, because whatever it is you're dealing with, they need to have input and be part of it. But as the case has always existed, it's very hard to get that.
It's hard in many sports, but even more so in a sport here where, by and large, these are still people who have jobs and families and other commitments. And so even just for them to slice out the amount of time they need to practice and focus and be competitive, to now slice out additional time, it's like you said, going back into the late 70s, you probably recognized, I can't continue to go after another Brier or that World Championship that eluded me and continue to be a part of the growth aspect.
If you look at any other player group, they need to have professional people representing them.
I guess you could say in curling that's never really developed fully from the player side.
It needs to. That's things I've told people here in the last 2 years. And and from the CCA side, I've also suggested to them, this is nothing to be feared. This is something you should be encouraging. Is to the organized player's voice needs to be part of what you're doing going forward.
Yeah. So I'm going to almost leave it at that, although I'll ask, because here's the thing. I'm not going to ask you about relegation. I don't even want to talk about it.
Well, I think
let's not even go there.
What my feelings are about that whole thing. And quite frankly, I started to express pretty clearly back as far as 2012 when I saw the whole wheel turning. And the whole wheel turned because of two things, the Olympics and the Grand Slam, that changed the complete complexion of the game from every point of view. And while the Brier and Scotties were great events for all the years that they were the mainstay of curling, to continue to run them today with an interprovincial competition where you've got events like the Olympics and the Grand Slam in existence no longer makes any sense. And while, great, have an interprovincial competition, but you know what? It's second tier. It's not your primary focus. Your primary focus has to be the best team. So my suggestion back in 2012, and my suggestion still is there today, no matter how you get there, the field of the Canada Cup and the Brier needs to switch. And a Canadian Championship today has to be the 10 best teams in the sport. And the only connection between this and this is the winner of this gets a spot in this. And what this becomes, this is your developmental level, this interprovincial competition.
But you recognize what the challenge with that is. The challenge is that the fan support, the TV revenues, the support, the focus is still on those events.
Well, it is. The whole issue is, people said to me, well, it just becomes another slam event. I said, oh, does it?
Not if it's the
representing trials
country.
Another slam event?
No.
No, the trials is determining who's going to represent Canada in the Olympics. The Canadian Championship is determining who's going to represent Canada at the Worlds. It's a whole different story. And we've reached a point where that event needs to be the best teams in Canada, not an event where you've got teams that don't even rank in the top 250 of the CTRS. It doesn't make any sense. And it's no longer, as I said, mediocrity is not entertainment. The best is entertainment. And if you're going to sell these as entertainment properties, we have reached a point, and granted, I go back to the 80s and the 90s, it was great, but the world has changed. And what has changed that has been the Grand Slam and the Olympics. And can you continue to run this thing the way you are with some of these Grand Slam teams in it, but not all of them, or not the best ones? I mean, as an example, 2 years ago, we end up with number one in the world. McEwen is not in the Canadian Championship. You're going like, who understands that?
Well, I think the struggle, right, is that the fan base, a large portion of the fan base, I don't want to say all the fan base, I don't want to speak for everyone that watches curling, but there's still an aspect that cheers for laundry, the laundry that has the colors of where you live and that representation. Right, it happens. Now, you think about other sports, right? So, World Series is... Well, no, but I'm saying right now the World Series is going on, and you have Cubs fans, but there aren't 25 ball players that live in Chicago that play for the Chicago Cubs, right? So I think the aspect, though, of the Brier and the Scotties that, no, I disagree with you there. There's still a large portion of the fan base that supports the fact they want to cheer for their provincial... I could accept that it's diminishing. I could accept...
Let me suggest to you, let's go back to the Brier field of 12 teams.
Yeah.
So if I go back to Brier field of 12 teams, and the women's is worse than the men, I'll be so bold to say on the women's side it's 7 provinces, territories that have absolutely no chance, none whatsoever, of ever getting anywhere near that final. And they might manage to slip in to be the 4th team in the playoff on occasion. But if they do, they will not go beyond that. They will only play one game because it's too mismatched. It's not possible. And somebody said, well, there's a Cinderella story. I said 2 things. First of all, we're at a point in time here when we're sending teams to World Championships that the whole funding from Sport Canada back to the CCA is dependent upon how those teams perform. We don't want any Cinderella shows. And secondly, that is not going to happen anymore. Those top teams, I guess the other thing people don't understand is how good they are. And while one of those Cinderella teams might play, I don't know, Kevin Cooey and beat him once, if he plays them 12 times, he'll beat them 11.
No, and I don't disagree.
And so it's completely unbalanced. It doesn't...
I absolutely support what you're saying, Warren. I guess the flip side, though, is that there's still a large portion of the fan base that is supportive of a provincial representation, and so that becomes a part of the spirit of it. Now, I do sense, because I've been a number of the last few Briers, that is waning, and that comes from a certain demographic almost. And so I can appreciate that what you're looking at is saying, I'm looking at this as a sport as it fits into other international and global sports, and that we need to think about where are we headed. Right, and I think it's just always a struggle in curling in particular, because it's got a lot of history and a lot of nostalgia, and and a lot of what this podcast is looking back at the 50s, the 60s, and that history. I struggle with it because I try to sit on both sides. One of the ones I thought, because you had an interesting article from last year, I think, in the Curling News about looking at almost a qualification through a Brier to then go into a 7-team Canada Cup, almost within the same event.
But my initial point was ease into this.
I thought it was a fascinating approach. The struggle with it, I thought getting one team through probably wasn't enough to allow for that, but take something like that. Yeah.
Take 2. Start somewhere. Start beginning to move the ball and see how that works. And at some point in time, move it one step further. But the point still remains, is this non-competitive situation is going to get worse and worse. And the other thing it's done, if you take and have an interprovincial competition that you eliminate these top 15 or 20 teams that they can't even enter it, you're going to improve the number of people that are going to try to play in this thing at this level. Right now, because of how it's structured, in these provinces where these better teams are,
there's no improvement. And I'd agree with you there.
Nobody's going to go in it.
You only have to improve as good as the quality of the province.
Some of those provinces right now, like Newfoundland, even PEI, there's maybe 3-4 teams entering a provincial. And in some cases, I think it was 2 years ago, Gushu, they had to find a team for them to play against. And I get it. I mean, people aren't... Why would you want to do that, to go out and subject yourself? I don't want to play golf against Rory McIlroy. Makes no sense. And it doesn't make any more sense for a team from Nunavut to be playing Kevin Cooey. I understand everything you're saying, and I still suggest that there is a place where that can fit, but it's not as your top focused national championship in today. Things have changed. The whole world has changed.
The other thing I recognize with it, and I really thought of this last year, the money now, and we talked about money available to the players now in the Brier. The money now available, you think about it, the most lucrative event to win sounds like it's most likely the Brier, as an example.
It is.
And yet it perhaps is one of the easier events to win, given the quality of the field. So we've already seen players moving province to province. So why wouldn't McEwen or Carruthers, let's say those two teams keep battling head to head to try to get out of Manitoba, and if they were to really look at it from a financial and from an opportunity basis, they might think that wouldn't it make more sense to just play out of a different province, right? Does it become worth it to them?
Except at this stage of the game, they legally can't do that.
Yeah. Well, or they could choose to move, or certain players could, and that's happened. I mean, you look at Ryan Fry's moved.
Yeah, I mean,
several
individuals
times.
have it to move a whole team. I mean, but then it all defeats it. It's like right now, you're trying to build the best possible teams for World Championships and Olympics, and now you're restricting them by where they can live.
Well, let's go back. And this will support you, Warren. Let's go back to the schoolboys. When you played in that schoolboys, where were your players from? The same school.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even within the 70s, right? Eddie Lukowicz told me, right? He had to play with guys in Medicine Hat. He couldn't curl with a guy out of Calgary. That just wasn't...
Well, I mean, go back to 1974 when we won the Brier.
You had to be,
We were all out of this curling club.
Yeah.
Three of us never set a foot inside this curling club.
Could you have had a player that was based in Calgary and just named him, or it wouldn't fly? Yeah.
No. I mean, it had loosened up by 74, but in the 60s, it had to be the club where you played the majority of your club games out of.
So you see that. So you see this as inevitable, I think, right? That it will transform.
If curling in this country wants to survive and continue to move, there's a whole pile of things that are inevitable. Like the world keeps changing, and you've got to keep thinking ahead of where are we going to go with all this? If this happens, that happens. And as far as I'm concerned, I sat down in a meeting in 2012, and my point was, I don't want everybody to be shocked about what I'm going to say, but what we've been doing here for the last 15 years has come to an end. And where do I ultimately see this? Ultimately, I see this is the Canada Cup and the Brier Fields just need to be switched. And everybody set their hair on fire. Oh, blow up the Brier, blow up the Brier. No, not blowing up the Brier. We're adjusting with the times as to what's happened. The world has changed. We have the Olympics. We had the Grand Slam. It's changed the whole complexion of what we're looking at. Believe me, I came through this system. Nobody has more tied to the traditions of things like the Brier and the historic aspects than I am. But I also don't want to sit here and look around 10 years and see that there's absolutely nothing left because we didn't adjust to what was happening.
And I took a long look at it last year, looking at the reduction in playdowns, right, and the numbers. I think part of it is people still want to hold back to this idea of, like we talked about before, just 4 regular guys or 4 regular girls who pick up and win a national championship. It's already passed us by that we're in an era where the term competitive curler is not the same definition of what it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Because we have a bunch of people who are professionals.
Exactly. So now what we're evolving into is there's 3 levels of the game I see. There's the professional level. There's those that want to aspire to that.
Yes.
And then there's all of the others who many of those others perhaps even believed 10 years ago, or maybe even still to this day, that they could win a Purple Heart. And the truth is, in some provinces they can. But the truth being is, that's shrinking. That piece, and that's the largest portion of it, which is those truly non-competitive, what was often made up of people who felt competitive. And now with that shrinking, we need to figure out how do we expand that piece.
But that's what needs to happen. We need to identify, we've got this, this, and this. And right now we're trying to move this all into one
I think the real struggle is that middle I think the aspiring one is the one that needs more work.
But we need to be, it needs to be more distinctive. We can't keep putting everybody in the same, one size does not fit all anymore. And I remember, I think it was the Brier Calgary in 2015, and the Ontario team, who was a new team. Keane, that's right. And I knew the grandfather, Vern Keane, he's a good friend of mine. And so one of the fathers of the kids in the team, I started talking to him, and this young guy, I think he's maybe 22, 23 years old. He's a good player, and his father said to me, "What do you think the future of my son is with curling?" I said, "Tell me about his life." Well, he's got a good job, he graduated, he's got this, he's got a wife, he's got 2 kids. I said, realistically, you know what your son's future as curling is? He doesn't have one. Because if that's where his life is and that's what he's doing, he can't compete with these guys that's all they do. They're professionals. So he's got a family, he's got a job. He's not going to fit into this mold because he can't dedicate his entire life to curling. And the top players, they're professionals. And that's what we're doing. It's like taking somebody in the PGA Tour and throwing them into the U.S. Amateur. it's not, among other things, it's not fair because they simply can't be at that level because they haven't got the time, effort, or energy to dedicate to it that these professionals have. They're in a different world. And that's where we have evolved. It's a different world.
It is a different world, Warren.
To mix it is no more sense than putting 10 people off the PGA Tour into the USA Amateur. Same thing. There's no chance that any of those guys in the Amateur are going to have to win if you put 10 guys in the PGA Tour in there. And that's where the Brier and the Scotties are today. Never mind win, they can't even come close. No chance. And so it becomes, what sense does this make? It doesn't make any sense. Not where we need to be going. And we need to be moving again. We've got to keep moving ahead. We've got to keep moving ahead. What can we do? I mean, they need these big table discussions where everybody involved with this sport needs to be in the same room. They need to sit down and talk about all these things. They need to, but it's the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about it.
You still seem to have the boundless energy, even at your age, to continue to look forward and move ahead. You still got it? Is that waning at all?
Yes and no. I mean, I'm working right now into an environment that it's way behind where Canada is.
In terms of working with the U.S.?
And I'm trying to bring that forward as much as I can because I see that as being the entire future of the sport. I see and the potential is there to become so strong in the United States, and if it does, it spins off big time in Canada and the rest of the world.
I agree.
But there's so much has to happen, and it's to some degree frustrating. There's lack of money, and seeing what probably needs to happen, and trying to convince the people that I'm working with there as to what we need to do and how we need to do it. And it's tough.
You might be one of the older brain drains that I've seen in terms of the business community from Canada to the U.S., but I have optimism that you'll succeed.
Well, I'm not sure for how long. I mean, I'm kind of dedicated 2 years to this and see what can happen in a 2-year period and be prepared beyond that maybe to act in a little bit of a distance. But I'm getting to the point where I'm not wanting to probably dedicate my time into running my head into the wall as often as I have in the past.
Well, that's good. Thanks, Warren.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nothing else you wanted to share?
Oh, there probably is. But
I think
that's enough. That's enough.